This is the Pat Campbell Show on Talk Radio 1170.
It is 10:05, 5 past the hour number 4 of this Monday edition of the Pat Campbell Show here on Talk Radio 1170, where Tulsa comes to talk and Oklahoma comes to listen. So we got a special treat for you. Gentleman I had on the program a while back, you may recall John Dwyer. He had a book called The Oklahomans, The Story of Oklahoma and Its People. He's got another book out. It's called Mustang, a novel of World War II. And with that said, John, welcome back to the program. Good morning.
Hey, it's an honor to be on the great radio talk show of Oklahoma, sir.
Glad to have you back. So tell me about this latest book, Mustang. What's this one all about?
Well, Mustang is the saga of, it's a World War II saga, and it tells the story of a group of young, initially carefree Oklahoma boys during the Dust Bowl that grow up during that period, and then World War II comes, and it tracks their incredible odyssey through the greatest aerial war in history, the European Air War. And Pat, I think one of the distinctives of Mustang, one reason that it's struck a chord with people is it's full. It's a patriotic tribute, and there's nostalgia, and it honors these guys that laid down everything they had for us. But it goes a step beyond and puts you in the cockpit. Both the B-17 Flying Fortress, the first half of the book, and then a Mustang P-51 fighter plane, the second half. And it really tells what I believe is important for us to realize, that there was a steep price that these guys paid, that in that era they never really had the opportunity to come back and grieve and download and deal with some of their issues like in later generations. So really, Mustang's the story of the boys that went to war, won the European Air War so that our soldiers could win on the ground below, but also the great price that was paid by even those that came back alive to home.
So I don't know if I've told you this story before, but my father recently passed away, and my dad grew up as a kid in Glasgow, Scotland. But when the war broke out, his dad had to go and, I guess, guard the coast or whatever they did at that time. And he sent my grandmother and my dad and his two brothers to London to live with relatives, which was a bad move because, as you know, London got bombed. But my dad was fascinated with World War II airplanes, in particular the B-17. I remember as a kid him taking us to air shows, and he could tell without even looking up when the B-17 was flying overhead because it had a pretty recognizable sound. But he would always take us to these air shows, and we had to go on the B-17. I think it was called the Flying Fortress, right?
Yes, sir, that's correct. Yeah, that was the great, Pat, I think we kind of, a lot of us grew up in a time where World War II, was just beyond our reach. We grew up as kids, we heard about it, the dads, the uncles, the granddads, they fought in it. It was kind of like just that important member of the family that was always absent from the dinner table, like an empty chair. They were just beyond our reach. And, my own father fought in the Pacific for 3 years, and, the New Guinea campaign, came back with totally bald after having a head full of curly blonde hair, caught malaria, got strafed on an airfield by Japanese Zeros, and died an early death, partly because of the diseases that he caught over there. So, part of my mission here, and you alluded to it, you've got family members yourself that were very involved, is that we have such luxuries and opportunities and comfort today. And it was just a fairly short time ago that, our forefathers were sacrificing their futures so that we would have all this that we have now.
So is this pure fiction, or is it based on some real people?
Yeah, great question. So there's really, some of your listeners probably read Shortgrass, which was the prequel novel to this. You don't have to have read Shortgrass to read Mustang. It's a standalone book, but if you are real interested, you can read both of them. And readers in Shortgrass, Pat, got to know Lance Roark, a fictional character, Oklahoma farm boy growing up during the Dust Bowl. But then when he gets into the U.S. Army Air Force during World War II, at the beginning after Pearl Harbor, there are four main guys, and one of them in particular who becomes his best friend is actually a real character. Waddy Young was the first consensus All-American football player ever at the University of Oklahoma. And that's really, Pat, where the genesis of this story began over 30 years ago, the mid-'80s. They were inducting Waddy Young into the Collegiate Football Hall of Fame at halftime of an OU football game, and I don't think any of us ever even had heard of him. And we heard of his football exploits that day, but also his World War II exploits. And it took over 30 years. That just shows how long sometimes it takes to get a story out there. So I'd say that to your listeners that are wanting to write. Don't give up. So there's a mix of fictional, real characters, and then other characters that are kind of composites. But being a historian as I am, I've taught at Southern Nazarene University in Tulsa and OKC since 2006. I drench it with the real history. And Oklahoma folks especially, you're going to have a lot of scenes that take place across Oklahoma in the late 30s and then during the war. So this is an American story, but it's in particular a story of what the Oklahoma boys did when they had to go off and do their part. Not that they were looking forward to that. They had a lot of better plans for their future than going and getting shot at 30,000 feet above Earth. But that they made that decision, and I was just kind of reminded, Pat, as I researched and wrote Mustang, why we call them the greatest generation.
You know, I don't know how many people are completely aware, but there's so much rich aviation history in this state. You go to places like Woolaroc, you can see a lot of it on display. What made Oklahoma ideal for the aviation really industry, especially in the early years leading up to World War II?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that, and to me, Pat, at the head of the line is a little bit of an intangible, and that is that Oklahoma has this pioneer streak, this explorer spirit that has never died out. I mean, we may have conquered the lands, we may be on the lands now across our state, but if you look at what happened, whether it be the land runs back in the 1800s, or if you look at the pioneer aviators, or even more recently, the oil and gas wildcatters, people founding new businesses and technology, and the renaissances of Tulsa and Oklahoma City with their downtowns, and I think that really is the DNA. Going way back, you had a bunch of people that came here that were poor people, that were tough people. They didn't have much money, but they had guts. They had audacity, and they went for the best they saw for their families and the people they cared about. And I really think, you talk about the aviation industry in Oklahoma, that really launched in the early 20s, and that was just a few years after the end, those last land runs. And one of the main characters in Mustang and the prequel Shortgrass is based on Pearl Carter Scott. Now, she was a real character, a real person from Marlow, youngest aviator in American history. She was taught by family friend Wiley Post. She began flying a biplane at age 13.
Wow.
And so we weave into the book, Pat, a kind of a fictional version of her named Sadie Stanton, and she becomes kind of the friend and love interest of Lance Roark, the protagonist, and that's what initially gets him into this love for flying. But as you say, that was in the 30s, and you had Wiley Post, you had Will Rogers, you had Pearl Carter Scott, you had many Oklahomans whose names we have forgotten, that were setting records, that were doing research, and I think part of it too is this part of the country. It's flat, the weather's pretty good. Even today we have Vance Air Base, we have Altus Air Base, we have Tinker Air Base. This is a place where it's great to fly.
So talk to me about the plane in particular, the Mustang, the legendary Mustang, and how this factors into your book.
You bet. Well, of course, the P-51 Mustang, when I go around and speak, in fact, I spoke at the Bartlesville Library just a few nights ago, and people were saying, a couple of people that read Mustang, they were saying, well, this needs to be a movie. And I said, well, if anybody knows Steven Spielberg, send him a copy, because he apparently loves the P-51 Mustang. In the Empire of the Sun, that was Christian Bale's breakout role as a child actor, at the end when the Mustangs rescued all the American and English prisoners of war. He hollers from the rooftop, P-51, Cadillac of the skies. And then a decade later, Saving Private Ryan, the great World War II epic. At the end of that movie, Matt Damon looks up when all hope is lost, and a P-51 Mustang saves the day, and he hollers, P-51s, tank busters. So it is a marvel of a engineering feat, Pat. When the Mustang came online, the reason it was so crucial and has historical impact on the destiny of our nation is that people don't realize, I don't think, and I didn't before I started researching for this book, Mustang, that we were losing the war in Europe, not just because the Allied armies had been shoved off the continent by Hitler's Nazis, but our own Air Force, the Germans were making mincemeat of these bomber fleets that we had. And so it took finally the P-51 Mustang coming off the assembly line in mid to late 1943 that was a fighter plane that could accompany our bombers all the way across Europe and back. So there were a lot of bomber boys that died before the leadership figured out they couldn't defend themselves alone against these. Some of those German fighter races, they had 250, 300 kills. They were probably the greatest air races in history. And we had 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old boys that have been in, playing sports and working part-time and going out with their girlfriend a few months before were up against these guys. So the P-51 Mustang came in. It was the greatest piston engine fighter plane in history. And people like Chuck Yeager and others made it famous. And I think it's not an overstatement, Pat, to suggest the P-51 Mustang fighter turned the course of the air war in Europe. It allowed us to clear the skies and take control of the skies from the German Luftwaffe, and only then were we able to get back on the continent with foot soldiers. We lost 6,000 men killed at Normandy, even with control of the skies. Can you imagine what would have happened if we'd have tried that invasion and the Germans were still ruling the skies?
We're talking with John Dwyer, author of Mustang. Did the plane itself, does that plane have a connection to Oklahoma? Was it originated here, built here in any way? What do you know?
Well, it was not originated here, but there were certainly planes that were built here in Tulsa. And, the Tinker Air Base in Midwest City, that, as you probably know, that actually was birthed and came up in World War II and became the greatest, American air base, the largest air base in the world. And as people are reading Mustang, flight training for the Mustangs, the P-54, P-47 Thunderbolt fighter planes, and others took place right here in Oklahoma, based out of Tinker and flying across the skies of Oklahoma. So once again, telling the story of the Mustang fighter plane in our book Mustang, it wasn't something where I had to, get very, I didn't have to get that creative to base the story here, because you had planes located here, you had the planes training here, the pilots, and you had the type of people, as we talked about earlier, with that audacious, daring spirit that Oklahomans have always had. And I might mention one other thing: the second highest kill total, or the second greatest fighter plane ace for America in the European Air War, was a Lawton native, Bob Johnson, who shot down nearly 30 planes.
Wow.
And so a lot of real Mustang history right here in Oklahoma, and it wasn't a stretch to base it here and have the guys flying the planes from here.
John, hold that thought. More coming up from my guest, John Dwyer, the book Mustang. If you've got a call, a comment, a question, 918-879-1170. That's 918-879-1170. You're listening to the Pat Campbell Show. Trade shows are an amazing lead-generating event for most business owners. If you've ever promoted your business at a trade show, you know you're going to receive a plethora of leads from just that one event. It's a great deal. Well, most of the time. However, many businesses never track if they make money at these costly events. At Hood, CPAs, they're constantly encouraging clients to know their numbers about every aspect of their business. Currently, a tornado shelter company working with Hood CPAs was traveling all over the Midwest to sell their shelters. However, they didn't track how many leads they acquired from each trade show they attended, the costs of their trade show, booths, employee costs to run the booth, much more. So were they even making their time, effort, and travel worthwhile? The Hood CPA proactive team challenged the business owner to find out if trade shows were producing revenue. Much to their surprise, there were only a couple of trade shows that produced enough revenue to make their efforts worthwhile. At Hood CPAs, they assist business owners to determine how many tornado shelters or whatever product or service you sell are needed to make enough money to live the lifestyle you want. Become a Hood CPA client today by visiting them online at hoodcpas.com. That's hoodcpas.com, or call them at 918-747-7000. That's 918-747-7000. That's Hood CPA.
1170.
1023. If you're just joining us, talking with John Dwyer, author of Mustang. John, if people want to find out more about that book, get their hands on it, or find out more about you, where do we send them?
Sure. I'd say jump on our website, Pat. It's John J. Dwyer. That's John, middle initial J, Dwyer, Dwyer, johnjdwyer.com. We've got information on Mustang, on the prequel Shortgrass, on the Oklahoman's history book you mentioned earlier. We've got features, video clips on all of those. And I might mention also for Tulsa friends, I'm going to be back at the Barnes & Noble in Woodland Plaza all afternoon, the Saturday before Christmas, December 21st, doing a Mustang book signing. So I'd invite your listeners to come out, mark that calendar. They're probably going to be out shopping anyway on the Saturday before Christmas. We'll be there all afternoon. We always have lots of extra chairs, and you don't have to buy anything at all if you don't want to. Just come hang out, and we'll do this. We'll, like you and I are doing right now, we'll talk about Oklahoma history. We'll talk about Oklahomans in World War II. We'll talk about the really untold story. You know, publishers from New York and movie makers in Hollywood, they love to overlook the flyover country. Mm-hmm. And, as we talk about here, there's really more than one reason why we are flyover country, because there's a lot of flying that goes on out here. And so come on out on December 21st at the Barnes & Noble in Woodland Plaza, or www.johnjdwyer.com. And you can also email me if folks have questions, if they want to chit-chat. I love interacting like I know you do with your listeners. I love interacting with my readers as well.
So, John, is part... Oh, go ahead and give out that email address. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was going to say, you can go to johnjdwyer.com, and there's a clear link there to email me. So Gotcha. That way, if they're driving down the BA or whatever, you don't have to write too much stuff down. Just remember johnjdwyer.com.
So as part of the research for this, did you actually interview people that would have flown a Mustang in that day and age? Because it's amazing when you talk with these guys. We refer to them as the greatest generation. But when you stop and think about what they did, they just stopped whatever they were doing. They disappeared for 3, 4, 5 years sometimes, and then just came back and picked up where they left off. And I don't know if we still have that kind of mindset in our culture that people would still do that kind of stuff. Did you talk to anybody as sort of background for getting inside the head of somebody that would have served in that era?
I did, Pat. In fact, this was a 7-year project of researching and interviewing and so forth. And before I forget it, I wanted to mention to your listeners, there's a great epic film out right now in the movie theaters that I figured it was pretty good when some of the Hollywood critics started bashing it, but it's called Midway, and it tells the story of American aviators in the other major theater of World War II, the Pacific,
right.
And what happened from Pearl Harbor as we were, the entire free world was on its back on the canvas, and the steep price it took for us to get up off our backs and turn the tide. So if folks haven't seen Midway, it is an epic. I have never seen a movie where it was so gripping and you felt like you were actually in the middle of it. And being in the middle of a torpedo plane diving at 200 miles an hour down toward a Japanese carrier is pretty breathtaking experience. But so go see Midway if you haven't. But my interviewing that was one of the memorable experiences Pat of riding Mustang. Was actually getting to visit with these incredible World War II heroes. For instance, John Lucky Luckadoo. He was a captain in the European Air War of a B-17 Flying Fortress. And again, the first half of Mustang, our heroes are flying in a Flying Fortress. The second half, it turns to the Mustang. But this Lucky Luckadoo, Pat, he was in the Bloody 100th, the most famous air group in World War II. And I spent 4 hours with him. He was 92 years of age.
Wow.
He's a sharp, probably sharper than you and I, remembering these events. And I'll just give you one example of the living history that I tried to catch with these men while we still had them. There was probably maybe the worst air raid or the most horrific experience that our airmen have ever had in a battle. Took place in World War II, the Regensburg Schweinfurt. It was a double mission. They went sideways. Weather got in the way, and we lost 600 men in one mission.
Wow.
60 planes. And then they tried it again. We lost 77 planes in one mission. That's why they kind of stood down, even though they said they didn't, until the Mustangs were ready to get in commission and go hunting those German fighters. Well, Lucky Luckadoo missed that horrible Regensburg Schweinfurt mission because the previous mission that he was captaining a B-17, a Focke-Wulf 190 20-millimeter cannon shell put out the windshield of his cockpit, blew right between him and the co-pilot, went out the back of the plane.
Wow.
But he had to fly back from eastern Germany for 5 hours, 30,000 feet in the air, minus 60 Arctic wind blowing in. He had frostbite on both feet and legs for a month. And when I interviewed him 60 years later, he still walked with a limp from that mission.
Wow.
But he went back and finished his missions. He flew 10 more missions. He just said whatever he had to do to make him think he was okay. And that was the determination. In this movie Midway that's out right now, it shows that, basically these guys in Mustang that we talk about in our book, they're not ready, they're green, they're young, they're inexperienced, they're fighting a German Air Force that's been in combat for years. And in one of the climactic points of the book, one of the guys asked the officer, says, "We're not ready." And his officer says, "I know we're not, but you're all we've got." And
wow.
I think, to me, that's the credo, that the epitaph for the greatest generation.
Yep.
Is they stepped up when they were all we had, and they got the job done.
You're all we got. John Mullane, we're going to end on that note. Thank you so much for stopping by today. Again, you're going to be in Tulsa when?
Yes, sir. The Saturday afternoon before Christmas, December 21st, at the Barnes & Noble Woodland Plaza.
Woodland Hills Mall, yeah.
Afternoon.
Right. Gotcha.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. You have a great day. We'll be back with more. You're listening to the Pat Campbell Show here on Talk Radio 1170, where Tulsa comes to talk and Oklahoma comes to listen. Stay tuned.